The Oblates have always been on the side of the poor. From the moment of our establishment, Eugene was concerned with the plight of the poor people in France of his day. He saw many people who were crying out because of their situations of abject poverty. And until today, our charism tells us that we should always have a preferential option for the poor. In fact, our rules tell us that the Oblates always consider themselves to be ministers of those people whose situation cries out for salvation. And we acknowledge these people to be the poor with their many faces. Since Eugene's time, our world has probably become a little bit more complex. And so the idea of poverty now kind of spans many different genres and categories. So we still have thousands of Oblates around the world who participate in what I would call a traditional mission, the idea that they are sent outside of their country of origin to a distant land where they minister to the people there, not only by building a church and saying mass and celebrating the sacraments, but also providing them with food, clothing, medical care, whatever's needed. That's the traditional kind of mission which the Oblates are still heavily involved in around the world to deal with those issues of material poverty. But there are some Oblates today who have taken on a ministry of justice and peace and care for creation in order to address some issues of poverty that are maybe wider than that maybe weren't recognised back in the early days of the congregation. In our globalised and very different world, we have to understand that the poor, whoever they be, don't always have control over the decisions that make them poor. So it's also important for us as prophets of the gospel, as ministers of justice in this world, that we be involved at levels within the world where decision making happens that affects those poor people. And so there are three Oblates that I would like to talk about who work in that kind of level these days to address structural issues of justice that affect millions of people around the world. The first of these is Seamus Finn, who works in the province of the United States. He is the Chief Officer of Faith Consistent Investing. He's the Director of the OIP, the International Oblate Investment Fund. So Seamus works, I guess you could say, amongst the rich and powerful of the world rather than amongst the poor directly. He works amongst CEOs of multinational corporations. He works with people of mining and natural resource companies, and he works also with million-dollar hedge funds. Seamus works in these areas because the decisions of these people can directly affect the lives of many people who are suffering around the world. And unless people at that level hear the Christian message and make decisions based on a Christian ethic, they can potentially make some very disastrous choices that can have negative effects for poor people down the line. So by combining his faith and his knowledge of economics in his ministry, Seamus helps to affect change and to help global companies to make ethical decisions that not only help them to continue to accrue wealth, but also to use that wealth in a way that help the most vulnerable and isolated in our societies. Daniel LeBlanc is another Oblate who works at the international level to effect change for the poor. Daniel LeBlanc, originally a Canadian Oblate, works now in New York City at the United Nations. Daniel LeBlanc works for an organisation called Vivat International, which is an organisation, an NGO, that holds a special consultative status with the United Nations. Vivat International is made up of 12 various Catholic religious congregations of sisters and priests and brothers, and through those 12 congregations, they would consist of more than 25,000 religious around the world, working in over 120 different countries. So by sitting at the UN in this consultative manner, and by bringing the wisdom of all of those religious congregations involved in Vivat International, Father LeBlanc is able to present the knowledge of the day-to-day lives of the poor that the religious experience in many different countries, and together with the different charisms of these congregations and the obviously essential Christian message, he's able to present that to the leaders of the countries at the United Nations to try and help them to make the decisions that are in the best interest of the poor and the most abandoned. Another oblate, a little bit closer to home, is Father John Wotherspoon, who currently lives in Hong Kong. During his time in Hong Kong, Father John has worked in different prison chaplaincies there, and during this time, he has noticed that many prisoners in Hong Kong are held very harsh sentences for drug trafficking, and many of these inmates come from different areas of Africa and South America, normally from very impoverished communities. And the situation pretty much goes that drug traffickers have managed to figure out where the poorest communities are, and to pretty much con these people into carrying drugs for them into Asian countries. And the Asian countries, as you would probably know, have some of the strictest punishments for drug traffickers. So this was a serious issue that Father John saw in the Hong Kong prisons. And rather than just ministering to the people in the prisons who have already fallen into this trap, he thought, no, God's justice demands that I go and treat this evil at its source. So through the generous donations of many benefactors, Father John was able to travel to these communities in Africa and South America to run education programs in those communities, to educate the young people of those communities about the drug trafficking rings that exist around the world. So in order to prevent any more people from making the same decision and being caught in this vicious cycle. This is a real work of mercy and of justice that Father John is participating in and is making a real difference to thousands of lives around the world.